This is a 1984 Mazda RX-7, and it's an awesome old school sports car. This is now 40 years old, the original RX-7, and it has rotary power and tremendously small sizing. In fact, this is about the size of a modern Mazda Miata. Today, I'm going to review the FB RX-7 and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this Mazda RX-7 is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is a 1984 GSL SE model, the most desirable one, and it's unmodified, a great survivor example of an FB RX-7 with less than 38,000 miles. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this RX-7, where you can bid on it and buy it with no reserve, only on Cars and Bids. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the original RX-7 with a general overview about this car. So, the RX-7 was sold from 1978 all the way to 2002, and it had 3 different generations through that time. This, the original car, is known by enthusiasts as the FB RX-7, and it was sold from 1978 through 85. Next came the FC RX-7 throughout the late 80s and into the 90s, and then there was the famous FD, Mazda's mid-late 90s RX-7. Now, the FD is probably the best known because it was the most powerful and it was beautiful, but the FB, this car, was by far the most popular. 60% of all RX-7s ever made were FBs. So the majority of RX-7s are this model, even though there were 3 different generations. And 80% of FB RX-7s were sold here in the United States. This car was a smash hit sports car for Mazda in the late 70s and early 80s, especially here in America. Now, as with any RX-7, the big story with this car is the rotary engine. I'm not going to get into the technical details of what makes a rotary engine different from a standard combustion engine with pistons and cylinders, but basically, if you think of it as 2 giant rotating Doritos, you'd be on the money. Now, rotary engine design was developed decades ago and it was used by various automakers at various times, but it was Mazda who became known for it, especially as they single-handedly carried rotary powertrains into the modern era with the RX-7 and then later the RX-8, which was built into the 2010s. In fact, Mazda even won Le Mans with a rotary-powered car in 1991. The 787B won outright, proving that rotary power has some nice benefits. Now, as for this particular car, like I mentioned before, the FB RX-7 was sold from 78 to 85, and during that time it was offered in basically 3 different series. This, being an 84 model, is a late production Series 3 FB RX-7. Now, when the FB first came out, it had only about 100 horsepower, but by 84 it was up to around 135. That may not sound like much, but this car only weighs a hair over 2,400 pounds, which is really amazing. In fact, the RX-7 kind of came to be known as this muscular, impressive performance car in the FD era, but the early RX-7s were more like the Miata in terms of their thought and their ethos. Small, compact, lightweight, low-power sports cars that gave you a thrill without being too, well, fast, to be honest. This car, at only about 169 inches long, is between a modern Miata and a modern Boxster in terms of its overall length. It was not a big car nor a heavy car, so not that much power wasn't that big of a deal. As for this car's particular trim level, it's a GSL-SE model, which is a little cryptic, but it was the top spec model at the time. The base version was the RX-7S, and you could upgrade to the GS, then you could upgrade to the GSL, that was the top luxury model, and then you could get the SE, which added some sporty equipment. Specifically, it had bigger brakes than a standard GSL, it also had sportier suspension for better handling, and it had an oil cooler to help keep things cooler under the hood in high performance driving. So, the RX-7 GSL-SE, a lot of letters and a number. So let's talk about that top spec RX-7 trim. You open up the door to this car to a sea of red, starting with these overstuffed red leather seats. They look very 1980s sports car because they are, but everything in here is red, not just the seats. The steering wheel rim, red. The interior door panel, red. The carpeting, red. The floor mats, the parking brake, the gear selector, it's all red inside this car. There was no thought of just doing like red seats like modern cars with red interiors. No, everything had to be red in this interior. The exception was the center control stack, which is silver, a very 1980s color combo, red framed with silver in the middle. And a couple of interesting things about this center control stack. At the top, you had your climate vents, which had individual switches, one for left, right, and then another for up, down. I guess in the 80s, they hadn't come up with the idea of one switch you could kind of do it all, which is interesting. You also had this stereo head unit, which is so deeply 1980s. All these adjustments along the bottom as if you could perfectly hear this song and know exactly what had to be up and down. And I know some people are going to respond to this video and say, I do know, but really, you don't. It was total overkill, but in the 80s, a lot of cars had this stuff, all of these stereo controls. Although, in this car, the most interesting stereo control is actually between the seats. It's this, which is a sound joystick. You can choose exactly where you want to hear the music, front, back, left, right, precisely placing the music exactly to the speaker you want to hear it from in order to optimize your sound experience inside your RX-7. Also in this center console area, of course, you have the gear selector. This car has a 5-speed manual transmission with a red shift boot, of course. No 6-speed here, but you could get the RX-7 with an automatic, although I don't know why anybody would. Of course, these days, people only really are looking for the manual versions. Now, another interesting control in this car was above your head. You had this giant, like, screw that you could twist. This was for the sunroof. Now, if you twisted it a little bit, it would pop open the sunroof to vent. But if you keep twisting, you'd actually release the sunroof and you could completely take it off the car if you wanted to and have like an open roof Targa topped experience in your RX-7. And then you could put up this wind deflector on the ceiling, which of course was also red. You stick that up and then wind would blow over you even if you had the sunroof off and you were enjoying the open air. Now, another interesting thing that pops up in the original RX-7 is the headlights. You turn on the headlights, and as you can see, they pop up out of the front end of this car. It was a very 1980s thing, although it's still cool today, pop-up headlights. Now, interestingly, in this RX-7, you have a little button here to the left of the steering wheel. You can push that, and the headlights pop up without turning on. People have told me over the years this is for cleaning the headlights. If you want to clean, I guess, without going to the trouble of turning on your headlights, you can do that by popping them up and then press the button the other direction and they close again. Now, interestingly, inside this RX-7, it is surprisingly luxurious. I already mentioned the overstuffed leather seats, but there's more than that. Some nice features. You had power windows. You can see the switches here in the center console next to the sound joystick. You had power mirrors to the left of the steering wheel. There's the switch you can use to adjust that. You had cruise control, as you can see right here, and you had air conditioning in this car, which was a nice feature to have. It wasn't necessarily guaranteed at this time period, especially in a car like this. In fact, it's impressive that you had all of these amenities in a car that still managed to weigh only around 2,500 pounds. You'd think in order to get this car down to its lowest possible weight, they'd strip all this stuff out, but they didn't have to. You had nice stuff and low weight at this time period. One thing this car doesn't have is power steering. It's manual and it is tough. You're steering at low speeds, difficult to do, although it does feel nice and communicative when you're going faster, which I'll get to in a few minutes. And next we move on to the cargo area in the RX-7, which you can access by pressing a little button to the left of the steering wheel in the driver's lower dashboard area. Press that, it pops open, and then you can lift up the glass and get into the cargo area. Now, only the glass lifts lifts up, as you can see. Everything else stays put, which means you have a really high liftover height. If you're trying to get something heavy in here, you got to lift it pretty far, not just over the bumper, but the tail lights, the badges, even some bodywork to get it in here. But once you do, you'll discover a surprisingly large cargo area, decent space in here, and it's completely connected to the interior. In case you have some giant long item that you want to go all the way through to the seats, you could do that if you want. And by the way, speaking of storage, directly behind the seats, you have these carpeted panels. Open them up and you have even more storage back here. Obviously, this is for smaller items and it's lockable. So if you want to keep stuff hidden or out of sight, you can stick it in there. But relatively clever, decent amount of storage in the FB RX-7. Now, a couple of interesting things about this rear glass. One, I loved how the wiper assembly just sticks here. This big plastic piece just tacked onto the glass. It looks ugly. At least they covered it up, but it is not attractive just having that kind of stuck on the rear glass. Also interesting, the rear glass handle is the only place it actually says RX7 in the back of this car. You can see on the bodywork above the taillights, you have Mazda and GSLSE. I guess they figured the trim level was more important to actually stick on the car than the name of the model. That's relegated to this glass handle piece, kind of subtle in back. But that rear badge wasn't the only place on the outside of the car where it said RX7. You also had these fender badges that said Mazda RX-7 on both sides, so you definitely knew what you were looking at as you walked up to this car. Also on the side, and interesting, is the rear view mirrors, incredibly small, just tremendously tiny. Driving this car and looking at those mirrors, it's impossible to see anything, but it was the standard of its time. It was all this car needed. In fact, in this era, you were lucky you got a passenger rear view mirror at all. A lot of cars still didn't have them. This one did. It was just tiny. Now, the other thing worth noting on the side of this car, the wheels, incredibly small by modern standards. 14-inch wheels, almost laughable, but they fit with the look of this car. It was tiny, little, low. Those wheels were all you needed. They actually look pretty good even today. Of course, as cars have gotten bigger and wheel arches have gotten bigger, wheels have followed suit, but these looked okay at the time. And speaking of design, the other notable thing about this car is the wedge-shaped front end, which was characteristic of sports cars that came out of the late 1970s. The Porsche 928 was famous for this, and other wedge-shaped front end cars all came from this period. The RX-7 was among them. It had this very distinctive look reminiscent of a certain time period that makes this car especially nice and nostalgic. All right, driving the FB RX-7. It's been a long time since I've driven an RX-7. I did an RX-8 maybe a couple of years ago for a video and I loved it. And I haven't driven an RX-7 though since I did a video on an FD like 6 years ago. The thing about these cars that makes them cool is the rotary powertrain. It is a distinguishing factor. It's unique and special. It makes these cars more interesting, enticing, exciting than a Nissan Z from this same era. But it's not just cool because that powertrain is a curiosity. It's cool because the powertrain is good. I love driving rotary powered cars. So here's the deal. Rotaries love to rev, and they do it with a smoothness that regular piston and cylinder engines just don't have. Rotary engines just go, and they do it in the most wonderful way. That's 6,000 RPM right there, and it's just such a smooth engine to accelerate it. You just feel like you're having fun as you get going. Now, you can hear, did you hear that little beep? That's the red line beep telling me, hey, you better upshift. And indeed I did. Now again, this car is not tremendously powerful, but the thing about it that was cool is it's just kind of fun. You can ring out the rotary, feel that smoothness, get all the way to that red line sound and really enjoy it. But also the car itself, even beyond the powertrain, is just wonderful. It is fantastically well balanced. It feels great. Manual steering, which is a disaster at low speeds, really difficult to move. Even as manual steering goes, it's pretty hard. But at higher speeds, it feels great driving this car. It's actually really, really nice to move it around corners. You just get so much more feedback than you do in, modern cars with electronic power steering. This car just transmits that you're doing it kind of feel to it. And I don't want to say it feels like a go-kart because everybody says that, but at 2,400 pounds and with steering like this, you really do feel like you're having a massive effect on the car. Like you're really turning the wheels and having a good time as you drive, even though you're not going all that fast. And you can downshift, rev match, and just get going around corners and feel like you're having fun. And that's the cool thing about this car. Now, with that said, some drawbacks. Lack of acceleration is definitely one of them. Good balance to this car, but I wouldn't necessarily call it fast. Even when you're ringing it all the way through, you're enjoying the rotary, but you're not like going all that quick at any point throughout that process. Also, it's pretty tight in here. I got the seat all the way back, and me as a taller driver, my knee is kind of pushing up against the steering wheel when I'm off the clutch. It's tighter than I was expecting inside this car, especially considering just how many of these they sold and how popular they were. Usually you get in a car that kind of feels tight like this, it was a niche car, not this one. But coming out of the late 70s, this is how a lot of sports cars were. You had to make some compromises to enjoy them, and this is one of those cars. Ultimately, I think this is a pretty cool car. It's little, it's fun, it's tossable. These are cool. These were neat, exciting cars. They're just not incredibly fast by modern standards, but they're not big by modern standards either. And if you want a totally different experience, a rotary-powered 2,400-pound 40-year-old car is that. It definitely has a nostalgia play to it, and these aren't really as expensive as you might think, because even though they're special, they're cool, they're nostalgia, they made a lot of them. So you can pick one up, drive it, and have some fun. And so that's the FB Mazda RX-7, the original RX-7. This is a cool old school sports car with unique and special rotary power. It doesn't have a lot of horsepower, but it's still a thrill to drive, and I'm happy I got to spend the day with the FB, and you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the original RX-7 a DOUGSCORE. And the DOUGSCORE is here, 41 out of 100, which places the FB RX-7 here against some relevant cars. This was an awesome sports car back in the 1980s, and it's fun to drive with great rotary power and nice handling. It's slow, but you're not buying it for all-out speed. You're buying for the experience, the retro feel, the nostalgia, and that smooth rotary powertrain. The RX-7 delivers all of that, and this particularly nice and original RX-7 delivers it especially well.